So this video is on Tomb Raider, which may be confusing to some people for two reasons. The first is that there have been quite a few games in the Tomb Raider series over the years. The second is that the newest game in the series just came out. Rise of the Tomb Raider was released for Xbox One in November of last year under a timed exclusivity deal. It's coming out for PC next week. This video is on the game that came out in 2013, which is the first in the new series. A reboot, as it's often called in movies and comic books. The series first began way back in 1996, and just so everyone understands what this video is about, I won't be making many comparisons to the first game. I played most of them when they first released and didn't like them. I was still in high school back then and had friends that thought they were great. Looking back, Lara Croft controlled in those early games like a baby on a pair of stilts, or a robot body being powered by two mice like in that episode of Pinky and the Brain. Not to say that's strictly a bad thing. Part of learning that game was mastering its initially awkward controls. It simply wasn't my thing, and I preferred other games that released at the time. The only reason I bring it up is for the sake of acknowledging that the series has a long history, and so that it's better understood how big of a change the reboot brought. The shift to something a lot grittier and mature was intentional, and it's hard to ignore the influence that games like the Uncharted series must have had on the reboot. I don't want this video to be overly long since it's mostly laying down a foundation so I can make an informed look at Rise of the Tomb Raider in February. That said, this game is pretty good. Judging by reviews, the sequel is even better, so the first game deserves at least some time devoted to looking at its successes and failings before it's overshadowed by the latest entry in the series. If you've watched my Fallout 4 and Diablo videos, then you know I'm very particular about stories. Many critics fall into the trap of having a hyper-focus on inconsistencies in narratives, and lording themselves over plot holes to make themselves feel smug. I know I'm not above this. I've done it in the past and I'll do it again in the future. It's something I've accepted about myself, but the concession I try to make is to meet the story halfway and consider two things. What sort of story is the game or movie trying to tell? Is consistency even important to that narrative? And secondly, even if it is important and a lack of it has destroyed that story, what else is there to enjoy once you've amputated it from the rest of the game? I remember the marketing for Tomb Raider showing it as a more serious take on Lara Croft. This was an origin story and a reboot in one, showing her struggle through some crazy, over-the-top action sequences, but still trying to be more believable at its core. The game ruins this within the first minute of gameplay. The opening cinematic shows Lara on a ship that quickly gets into trouble and is wrecked. She falls into the sea and is nearly killed as she is swept onto the island that the ship has crashed into. She is then knocked out by some unknown assailant and taken prisoner in a nearby cave. So far this is okay. I'll get back to this opening in a little bit, but for now I just wanted to show you how she ends up in this position, captured and hanging upside down and forced to find a way to free herself. Then she falls, and this happens. Your character takes a lot of damage in video games. In old games, this wasn't something anyone questioned because you weren't so much a character in a story than you were an abstract avatar in wacky video game worlds. Or you were a hero in a game with opponents that don't have weapons that would kill you in one hit if they were real. Put another way, as more games have been set in something closer to the real world, and with real weapons like guns, it's become harder to accept that your player character can shrug off all this damage. The strange agreement that we found ourselves in today is that damage taken by the character during moments that the player is in control isn't considered canon, meaning since a player could theoretically avoid all damage if they played tediously or luckily enough, that bullets only inflict scrapes that you can ignore with regenerating health that no one ever comments on. But if you're shot in a cinematic story sequence, then suddenly that means real damage that has consequences. It's not an ideal situation, but it's something we all silently go along with because it would greatly limit combat sections in games. So yeah, she falls and this happens, in a cinematic. Lara is dead at this point. The damage this rebar spike inflicts on her should be enough to kill her, or if she's very lucky, a little while after she rips it out and causes even more internal damage. If by some miracle avoided rupturing any major organs, the infection she would get from wading through bloodied, polluted water a few minutes later would be enough to finish the job. But not only is she fine, she's running and jumping and fighting throughout the rest of the game without ever receiving any medical attention for the hole that has been spiked through her abdomen. This happens early enough that it would be okay if the rest of the game used this as a point of reference for realism. What I mean is that this story is one where characters can survive brutal punishment and keep going, and that this moment is here to inform the player that it isn't going to try to be realistic, and that maybe I was wrong with the impression that the game's trailers left me with. A friend of mine told me that I'm giving the developers way too much credit by thinking like this, but I'm not sure. Either way, the game unfortunately isn't consistent about this for the rest of the game, and for this reason and many others like it, the story is hard to care about, which is a shame because the rest of the game is very well made.
What is this place?
Before continuing, I think this is a good place for a spoiler warning. I also want to say that this video will be discussing gameplay and not just story and stupid plot holes. If you like the Uncharted series or any kind of third-person shooter with exploration elements, then you'd probably enjoy Tomb Raider. This video will spoil several of the better set pieces of gameplay, so if you plan on playing the game, I'd stop watching now and come back to the video afterwards. Let's split up the individual pieces that make Tomb Raider the game it is. I want to take away visuals and sound design first. I'm not an artist, and I don't feel comfortable judging this sort of thing in an objective way. All I can say is that I think the game looks incredible, especially in the forest and mountain sections. There was never any voice acting that sounded bad to me, even though some of the dialogue was poor.
Whoever calls this island their home appears to be worshipping some kind of female goddess.
I think the game's visuals are one of the strongest things it has going for it. On the technical side, the game ran well whenever I was in control. I didn't encounter any major bugs. During some cinematics with multiple people talking, the game started to get a bit choppy. The shaky camera during these sequences also ended up being more distracting than stylistic, to the point that I sometimes wondered if it was glitching out. So we're left with story and 3 servings of gameplay: combat, exploration, and set pieces. These 4 are the real meat of the game, and in an ideal world, they would all be mixed together to make something stronger than each piece is individually. Unfortunately, the way they're spaced out on the screen right now is how they remain throughout the entire game. There are subcategories of each of them here. For story, you have Lara's journey on one half, and then the mystery of the island on the other. For combat, you have head-on gunplay sections and then stealth areas. For exploration, there's the way you learn to pick your own path through an area and how you get better at it the more you play. But there are also a ton of secret collectibles and hidden puzzle tombs to find. Lastly, set pieces come in 2 flavors. You're either fighting for your life and have to make quick decisions, or you're working through a gauntlet of obstacles and given time to work your way through. Both of these use QuickTime events. These 8 core features will cycle and repeat while you play the game. Occasionally you'll have some that bleed together, but they're mostly exclusive from each other, quite firmly divided into a series of chunks. Going through the first hour or so of the game is a good way of showing how each of these sections works on their own. When you're first given control, you're stuck hanging from the ceiling and can only move Lara in 2 directions. Then your perspective shifts and you're limited again from a different angle. Video games have the unenviable problem of having to assume that some players might not be familiar with this type of game, or haven't ever played a game at all. So after falling and surviving the spike from earlier, your controls are freed from their 2-directional limit, but you have nowhere to go except through a narrow linear path. There are no enemies here. Lara voices some of her concerns about being caught again, but it's just to build up tension. You have all the time you want to learn how to move her. In the next room, you're introduced to 3 mechanics in another safe environment: jumping, climbing, and fire. Fire is used a lot throughout the entire game, and you're also being taught to look out for things that are more brightly colored as clues for how to get through areas. It's usually things that are white or have a white trimming to tell you can grab onto it or burn it. You have your first QuickTime event here when you're attacked, but not in a way that results in any combat. You have to follow the prompts on the screen, and this is the same way every other QuickTime event is handled in the rest of the game. I don't think they get any more challenging either. I'm pretty negative on QuickTime events, but they serve their purpose in this game by allowing Lara to do something that's more visually interesting, but not wrenching total control from the player. Next up is a puzzle section that expands on the use of fire. You're also introduced to Lara's survival instinct ability, which is something you always have available to you in order to highlight objects you can interact with. I want to talk about that toward the end of the video, but for now, let's acknowledge that it exists and move on. This puzzle mimics many of the hidden tombs you can find throughout the island, and certain rare events in the main story like moving up locked elevator near the end of the game. There's no combat or timer here, and you can take as long as you like to complete it. After this, we transition into an escape sequence with some running, jumping, sliding, and finish with a QuickTime event. Then we're free to move forward with what feels like a tutorial after the tutorial, with another linear path and some simple climbing sections. You cross a fallen tree bridge and then climb a crashed airplane to proceed. There are some story sequences here that play like short movies. Lara begins to struggle for survival on the island, and you're given the first of many open areas to explore at your own leisure, with a goal that you can complete when you're finished looking around and checking off collectibles from a long list. You're also given your first weapon, a bow, in order to hunt deer for food. Moving quickly forward, you go through an underground tunnel to the second open area and meet up with some of your friends from the crashed ship. There's another story sequence here, but this time it's about the island rather than Lara herself. You fight off some wolves in one of the better QuickTime-esque events. The first hidden tomb is in this area, and it's strange that this is both the most interesting and difficult one of them all. You need to effect change on the environment to move a crashed plane to create a path to some treasure. Finally, after completing this area, you have another story sequence that leads to the first of 3 types of encounters: a stealth section to avoid human enemies, then a gunfight with them after you reach a certain point after remaining hidden, and then an escape from a burning building. All of these are short as they serve as introductions to these type of sequences you'll be encountering many times throughout the game. So do you see how they're all separated? There are no enemies while you explore or solve puzzles. There are no complicated jumps or climbing sections while you are in a gunfight. The story parts take control away from you. The QuickTime events are obviously apart from the rest of the game, even in how the player controls it all. I want to be clear that I'm not overly criticizing the game for doing this. I think that all these separate sections are fun and enjoyable, and if we're talking about video game narratives, this isn't the type of game you should expect some revolutionary departure from the norm that is uncontrollable movie pieces. The gunfights are standard for third-person shooters. The stealth is functional, which is more than most games can say. Lara controls while climbing and navigating more acrobatic paths. The game is good as it is, but I can't help wonder how great it could have been if all these different gameplay elements had been mixed together. Consider that the pattern of events I just went through in the first hour of the game continues for the rest of it. There are sections later on that are even physically separated and you can only go through them once. They don't have any collectibles and are either combat sections or acrobatic set pieces. And this break from the large, open, explorable parts of the island can be refreshing in how focused they are. But then there are parts, just over halfway into the game, where you escape a burning temple and have enemies to fight at the same time, when the different modes of gameplay mix ever so slightly, or after you find the shotgun and have to use it during sliding sections, where you were previously limited in how Lara controls, but now you have more to do and have to react to obstacles that you can break with that shotgun. There's also a memorable set piece where you're fighting some enemies on this wrecked ship that is being strung up in the air, and the fight suddenly transitions from an action sequence into an acrobatic one while you're still under fire. Or an escape section a little before this, wherein the game flirts with the idea of having some of the puzzle elements in the hidden tombs mix in with combat. These moments are too few and far between, and they work both for and against the game. They stand out in my mind as my favorite sections, but are also good enough for me to wish that the game took the concept further. Let's look at 2 levels so I can better explain what I mean. Early on you find Lara's mentor who has been attacked by wolves. His leg has been chewed down to the bone, and yet he's somehow still standing on it, but never mind about that. He passes out shortly after you find him, and you're given as much time as you want to explore this small settlement that's been built into the side of a mountain. There are multiple paths to the top, lots of collectibles to find, and learning the layout is genuinely fun. It's not a linear path, and some care has clearly been put into making it something interesting to navigate. There's even an impressive moment a little after this when you find the climbing pick, where you're shown even more routes to the level that you probably didn't even see before. Not to mention the different obstacles here that require tools from much later in the game so you can come back and open more of it up. Later on is a shantytown that's similarly layered with paths and hidden extras, only this time it's focused on the combat sections that occur here instead of a more intricately designed layout. You can see the difference between the two, but also in how they play when you realize that the previous mountain area never has any fighting. The only enemies are when you reach a separate, smaller area at the top that's a prelude to another section on the island. Mirror's Edge has a similar protagonist in that the player can navigate through the levels in an unusual, acrobatic way when compared to most other games. There's also the opportunity to get good at it too, that is never really required by the game but is still rewarding. But where Mirror's Edge succeeds in bringing this together with enemies that can chase you through these environments, Tomb Raider falls short by keeping them separate. This mountain is one of several climbing parks spaced throughout the game that never go to the fun conclusion of having enemies with similar talents as you chasing you through them, or pressure you into thinking creatively about how to get through them all. Lara is quite overpowered in combat, so when the supernatural elements are introduced halfway into the game, having some sort of immortal enemy that is just as agile as you now appear in some of these areas could have been great, so you can't rely on combat and have to learn something new instead. Let's talk a little more about that, how strong Lara is in this game. There's a moment after you get the rope shot that you have to stop and wonder if this is meant to be a superhero origin story, and not just a Tomb Raider one. This goes beyond what she's been physically capable of so far, and was the final nail in the coffin for me taking the story seriously. Once a game starts breaking its own rules, the whole thing is done outside of enjoyable combat mechanics. There's a similar moment later on when Lara's mentor Roth takes an axe in the back that kills him in seconds. Remember, this is the game that has Lara lunging and laughing while there's still a bloody hole on both sides of her shirt. She also does finally get injured enough to warrant some medical treatment, but it's I think a full 2 days after she first falls in the cave after she tumbles through a forest. You think it might be some other injury after this, but no, it's the same wound that she goes for after falling. She cauterizes it with one of her arrows. But it's the inconsistency between movies and gameplay that's upsetting because I think it could have been prevented. There are 3 moments I'd like to show: when she crossed the fallen tree bridge at the start, when she first gets a gun and has to use it, and the first stealth takedown shortly after that. It's never quite clear what kind of background that Lara has, or how much you're meant to assume because of the old Lara's abilities from the previous Tomb Raider games. She occasionally thinks back to past lessons that Roth taught her, and she must have had some sort of gymnastic skill in order to do the things she does early on. She seems familiar with the bow that she finds, but what about guns and killing people? There's a section later on when you return to the crashed ship you arrived on. This is a nice moment, but I think it could have been greatly enhanced by having you start out on the ship before the crash, so you can explore it yourself and see what it looks like before it's wrecked later. And this could have been an opportunity for some much needed context on what Lara is capable of. Maybe some sort of short tutorial here with Roth drilling her instead of teaching everything in the opening cave. Because in the cinematic here, when she crossed the tree, she seems unsteady and unsure, and as soon as you have control, you can hop and jump all over it without any issue whatsoever. Then she looks at the crashed plane and has some hesitation, but not really that much considering this is beyond what any ordinary person could be capable of. I think this could have been better set up by having Lara be confident about crossing the tree here so she can show off how acrobatic she is and set a standard going forward. Similarly, with guns later on, the story and gameplay only work if you're new to third-person shooters. Anyone who's played one before is going to channel through Lara and make her Lucifer Croft, Destroyer of Worlds. Halfway through the game she yells out with confidence about hunting the people down who have been causing trouble since the crash. But any experienced player is already going to feel like that in this first combat section. There's a leveling system in this game that I think is meant to illustrate this growth in Lara. This suggestion may be controversial, but I wonder if she should have started nerfed for a lack of a better term at the start, and that a lot of these upgrades would have brought her back up to the standard competency of other games. That aiming would be difficult to do because of a tremble, as an example, until you level up and get a perk to show her and you getting better together, like how aiming could get faster and tighter in the original Deus Ex with skill-ups. The same goes for the first stealth takedown. It would have been a cool moment if the player executed this well, but then Lara messes it up. It could have turned into a struggle instead, with her barely winning and knocking him forward instead of strangling him, so that functionally the stealth kill was still a success, but it shows her inexperience early on coming through. This problem of player versus character competency is an issue in many other games, but it's especially egregious here because the story is setting the protagonist up as someone who is out of their depth and thrown into a situation they've never experienced before. As for combat itself, I've played so many shooters over the years. I feel comfortable saying that they're the bread and butter gameplay of the industry. They're simple to understand and play once you've been exposed to one of them, and they're also somewhat grounded in reality and match many action movies. I played Tomb Raider on hard and never felt challenged, but that's fine. I've played a lot of games and not every release should be like Dark Souls. I think that third-person shooters with cover mechanics are as much fun as you make them, meaning if you find a corner of a level to hide behind and play a reverse game of whack-a-mole, wherein you're the mole with a submachine gun murdering someone each time you pop up, then I think it's your own fault if you think the combat was boring at the end. I tend to play these games more recklessly instead, weaving between melee attacks and shooting, and trying to move from cover to cover as I do so. For a while I tried to stay exclusively with the bow, but there were too many enemies in later sections of the game to stick with it. The scramble ability was also enough to change things up a bit from other shooters, and became invaluable in surviving when I had purposely gotten myself in a bad situation. I also like how the different melee abilities were incorporated seamlessly into the shooting. I would have liked some more enemy variety, but I already spoke about that earlier. As for QuickTime events and climbing sections, I liked the set pieces. They were visually impressive, and outside of button prompts, they did a fair job in making me feel like I was in control of a cool moment in a movie. But when the game resorts to only button prompts, I can't help but get bored. I also think it's unfortunate that pains weren't taken to remove them when they weren't strictly necessary. After you see Lara lose her grip on a ledge and start to fall off once, the player should be expected to recognize it and hit the button instead of being told to by the game. Same goes for finding a more organic way to prompt the player during melee fights instead of an icon telling them what to do. For the last talking point on gameplay, let's look at the survival instinct feature and the hidden tombs. At first this ability didn't seem problematic to me, it's just a highlight. It shows you what items can be interacted with. Since environments in this game are so densely cluttered, it should be a welcome addition that you can minimize all the crap and quickly see what options you have to work with. Unfortunately, the puzzles in this game are so insultingly simple that the process and the answer are usually one and the same. There is little thought and the solution is, interact with those objects in the only real way that you can. The end. I'll show some examples, but first let's go back to the first hidden tomb. The first time I went through this, I loved it. This is the first one, and it's like this. There are many stages of progression here with using the tools around the tomb to make a path, and you effect change on the level in order to proceed. There's even a blocked path that you can remember to come back to later. But as I said earlier, this is the most complex of all the tombs in the game, and it's the first one. And you can't really argue that they're hidden so that maybe they're worried players could do them out of order, since there's a giant broadcast message on the screen when you finally do get near one, so you can't miss them. Most tombs are a waste of potential. There's one where you have to weigh down an elevator system and then use it to time a jump to reach the top, and when I did this I was thinking, okay, so that just introduced the concept of weighing things down. Let's see how they take this concept and run with it. And instead the tomb is already over. It's done. That one introductory puzzle was all there was. There's a similar experience in the tomb with a strong wind blowing through the whole area. You have to use shutters to block the wind, and then time another elevator system so you can ride the wind to a climbable wall. And that's also the end. You've done the challenge. You can stumble your way through these with survival instinct highlighting all the relevant parts, and then just smashing them together. This is a shame because the game already has a built-in highlight by using white paint for important pieces of the level. This instinct function should have been limited to easy mode to help people new to video games.
Beautiful. Was this part of a larger complex of ruins?
In closing, let's speak briefly about the story. It's unfair to pass judgment on it in the opening scene when she falls on the spike. If this establishes the game is not being super serious, as the supernatural elements with the undead queen and her zombie subjects reinforce later on, then it would be fine. But it's when the game breaks its own rules that it falls apart, as I mentioned with Roth's death earlier. Other moments are when the game makes you run away from 3 guys in a cinematic when you just finished murdering over a dozen of them and you're still armed. Or you're sent to rescue a friend who went back to your ship for tools and he ends up dying getting them. And it turns out the tools were just a wrench and a flathead screwdriver. That's it. That's all. This guy dies for 2 tools you could have scavenged in so many other places on the island, but it's even worse because there's a weapon upgrade system in this game using salvaged parts you find all over the place. What tools is Lara using to do all this if a wrench and a screwdriver were so important that a guy had to die? The story had potential and parts of it still managed to be good. The undead queen is causing extreme weather all over the island so that when people arrive here, they're stuck and can't leave. The game's main antagonist is someone who is stuck like you are and has been for years, and this is honestly quite interesting. If the story had made him out to be more sympathetic, then he could have been a good villain since he has relatable motivations for doing the things he does. Instead, he ends up being a vapid cult leader, so the game has an excuse for having hundreds of fodder enemies for you to fight throughout the game. There's a traitor in your group that is foreshadowed so heavily that I thought it was setting up a moment of subversion when he doesn't betray you, but he does anyway. There's your mentor who you save who magically teleports up a cliff later on in the game. Then there's the big revelation moment about how the queen needs a new host to survive that comes insultingly late in the plot. And Lara acts like this is a dun 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 moment, but anyone who's been paying a little attention to the plot would have worked it out hours ago, especially if you find the collectible journal snippets around the island. It's strange because the plot about the island is like a B-movie that's so bad it sometimes feels intentionally satirical. There's the Nazi involvement that this genre is saturated in, thanks to Indiana Jones, but with the island not allowing people to leave, you have to wonder how they managed to build all the bunkers and radio towers. It feels like it's trying to make fun of it all, but then Lara's personal story is presented as something you're meant to engage in and take seriously, and it usually works. It's the most enjoyable part of the narrative, and I wish it had been reinforced with gameplay. The times that it does fail more than anywhere else are moments where Lara is in danger. There's no tension here because you can restart the section. So when the camera shakes abruptly into a fall, or pans out to show her in a very dangerous situation, you can admire the scenery but don't feel any stress. I wonder if the incredibly explicit death scenes were meant to provide that danger, since you'd want to avoid seeing your character suffer so much when you do die. My favorite moments of characterization of her were when you find hidden treasures and Lara comments on them. It shows how knowledgeable she is, and they can even be funny when you turn the artifact and confirm that they're fake. It's a shame that the same care wasn't put into the treasures in hidden tombs. They end up being just chests that you raid like any common looter. I enjoyed my time with Tomb Raider. I'm looking forward to improvements in the sequel, whether that's more intertwined game mechanics or something more focused on the strengths in the first game. I wondered while playing if the game was originally designed to be all about the bow and Lara couldn't use guns at all. It would fit with her apparent experience before arriving to the island, especially since it's the weapon she's always using during cinematics. I also wonder if the game was originally intended to be an open world style Metroidvania, with the upgrades you find later unlocking earlier paths. Some levels feel like they were designed well ahead of the story sequences. That's also something I hope is fixed in the next game. Thank you very much for watching. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe to the channel. If you'd like to support future videos, check out my Patreon page. I've also started doing weekly updates there on upcoming videos, so if for whatever reason you'd like to know that stuff, you can read those without pledging anything. I'm playing through Darkest Dungeon and Dragon's Dogma at the moment. I don't know which game I'll do a video on first, but I'll be doing both of them before Rise of the Tomb Raider. Thanks again.